They chose that crossing because it looked calm. No rushing water, no visible current, no signs of danger, just a wide, slow-moving river cutting through the land like it had done for centuries. To anyone passing through, it seemed like the safest option. And in the frontier, safety was never guaranteed, but sometimes it looked convincing enough to trust. That's what made it dangerous. The group had been traveling for weeks by the time they reached that point. Wagons worn down, animals tired, supplies carefully rationed. Every decision mattered. Every stop carried risk. So when they saw the river wide, shallow-looking and quiet, it felt like a rare advantage, a place where things might go smoothly for once. They didn't rush into it immediately. No one experienced on the frontier ever does. They stopped at a distance first, watching, observing. The surface of the water moved gently, almost too gently. No white water, no visible drop-offs, no obvious rocks. The banks were open, giving easy access for wagons to enter and exit. It checked every box of what a safe crossing should look like, but what it didn't show was what lay beneath. The first wagon approached slowly. The driver kept the oxen steady, getting them into the water with careful control. The wheels touched first, sinking slightly into the riverbed. That was normal. Every crossing involved some level of resistance. The key was consistency. If the ground beneath stayed firm, the wagon would move through without issue. At first, everything seemed fine. The oxen stepped forward, water rising slowly up their legs. The wagon followed, stable, controlled. People watching from the bank began to relax. This was working, this was easy. And that's when the first sign appeared. Subtle, almost unnoticeable. The wheels didn't roll forward smoothly. They dragged just slightly, enough to require more force from the animals. The driver noticed it immediately. He adjusted, urging the oxen forward with more pressure. They responded, but slower than expected. The water still looked calm. Nothing on the surface explained the resistance below, but something had changed. What they didn't realize was that the riverbed was not solid. It wasn't rock or packed earth. It was layered sediment, soft, unstable, and uneven. On top, it appeared firm, but beneath that thin surface was a deeper layer of mud that shifted under weight. When the wagon entered, the pressure broke that top layer, and the wheels began sinking gradually. Not instantly, not dramatically, slowly. That's what made it so dangerous. Sudden danger can be reacted to. Slow danger traps you before you understand what's happening. The driver felt it now. The wagon was heavier. The movement required more effort. The oxen strained harder, pulling against something that seemed to resist them from below rather than ahead. He had a decision to make. Continue forward and hope the ground stabilized, or stop and try to pull back. Both options carried risk. Stopping in unstable ground can cause deeper sinking. Moving forward can lead into worse conditions. He chose to continue. The wagon moved another few feet. Then the resistance increased sharply. One of the wheels dipped lower than the other, not enough to tilt the wagon, but enough to shift its balance. That shift changed everything. Now the load was uneven. One side carried more weight, pushing deeper into the unstable ground. The oxen struggled harder, but their footing was no longer secure. The riverbed beneath them shifted with each step. The calm surface of the water hid all of it. From the bank, it still looked manageable, but inside the crossing, it was becoming unstable fast. Voices began to rise from behind. People noticed the delay. Something wasn't right. The driver pushed the oxen again. They leaned into their harnesses, muscles straining, trying to pull the wagon free. For a moment, it moved, just enough to give hope. Then it stopped again. That was the turning point. Because once a wagon stops in that kind of terrain, getting it moving again becomes exponentially harder. The wheels had sunk deeper now. The mud beneath had closed around them, creating suction. Not visible, not dramatic, but powerful. Every attempt to move forward only shifted the pressure deeper into the ground. The driver realized it too late. He tried to redirect, angling slightly toward what looked like firmer ground. But the change in direction only made the resistance worse. The wagon tilted slightly, not enough to tip, but enough to shift the load again. Inside, supplies moved, weight redistributed, stability decreased. The oxen lost coordination. One stepped forward while the other struggled to find footing. That imbalance reduced their pulling strength. Now it wasn't just the ground working against them, it was their own movement. From the bank, a decision had to be made. Wait and see or intervene. Intervention meant risk. More people entering the river, more weight on unstable ground, more chance of making the situation worse. But waiting could mean losing the wagon entirely. They chose to act. Two men moved forward carefully, stepping into the water, testing the ground with each step. At first it held, then they felt it, the same shift beneath their feet. Not solid, not reliable, but they continued. They reached the wagon and began trying to relieve weight, unloading some of the supplies. This is a common response, but it only works if done quickly and efficiently. In this case, time had already been lost. The wagon had sunk too deep. Removing weight helped slightly, but not enough to reverse the situation. Then something happened that no one expected. The riverbed shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough to drop one wheel further than before. The wagon tilted more noticeably now. Water began to rise along one side. Inside, items shifted again, adding pressure to the lower side. The balance was gone. The driver tried one last push. The oxen strained with everything they had. For a brief moment, the wagon lifted slightly, breaking some of the suction. It moved forward just inches. Then it dropped again, deeper. At that point, the outcome was no longer in question. The wagon wasn't crossing. It was sinking. The focus changed immediately, no longer about saving the wagon, but about saving what could be taken from it. More people entered the water, moving carefully but quickly now. Supplies were pulled out, passed back toward the bank. Every movement had to be controlled. Rushing would cause more sinking. Slowing down would cost more time. They worked in that narrow balance, pulling what they could while the wagon continued to settle into the riverbed. Within minutes, it was clear. The wagon would not come out. The river that looked calm, safe, and manageable had taken it, without force, without noise, without warning. And that's what made it worse. Because now they understood something they hadn't before. This wasn't just one bad crossing. This river wasn't safe at all. They didn't lose just a wagon that day, they lost certainty. Up until that moment, the river had looked like a problem that could be solved with effort. Now it had become something else entirely, something unpredictable, something that didn't follow the usual rules of the frontier. The wagon sat half submerged, tilted at an angle that made it clear it would never move again. The water around it remained calm, unchanged, almost indifferent. That was the part that stayed with them. There had been no warning. No visible danger, just a quiet surface hiding something far more unstable underneath. They pulled back to the bank slowly, carrying what supplies they could recover. No one spoke much at first, not because they didn't understand what had happened, but because they were trying to process it. On the frontier, most dangers reveal themselves clearly. A fast river shows its current. A steep slope shows its risk. Even storms give signs before they arrive. But this had looked safe, and that's what made it worse. The leader of the group walked the length of the bank, studying the river more carefully now. Not just the surface, but the edges, the way the water met the land, the texture of the ground beneath it. He crouched near the edge and pressed a stick into the mud. At first it held, then it sank deeper than expected. He pulled it out and tried again a few feet away. Same result. The surface was firm only for a short distance. Beneath it, the ground was unstable. That explained the first wagon. But it didn't solve the problem. They still had to cross. Going around wasn't simple. The river stretched far in both directions, and the land beyond it wasn't guaranteed to be better. Backtracking meant losing days, maybe weeks, and burning through supplies they didn't have in excess. Staying in one place wasn't an option either. The frontier doesn't support hesitation for long. If you stop moving, problems begin to stack up. So they had to decide. Wait for conditions to change or try again. Waiting had its own risks. If the riverbed was this unstable now, it wouldn't improve quickly. And if temperatures dropped, the situation could become worse in a different way. Freezing conditions create hard surfaces on top, but leave soft layers underneath. That kind of trap is even more dangerous. Trying again meant accepting that they didn't fully understand the river. And that's what they chose. Not blindly, not carelessly, but because the frontier often forces decisions where every option carries risk. This time, they approached differently. Instead of sending a full wagon immediately, they tested the ground more thoroughly. Several men entered the water on foot, spreading out slightly, using long poles to probe the riverbed ahead of them. They moved slowly, step by step, marking areas where the ground felt more stable. It wasn't perfect, but it gave them something they didn't have before, a rough path. They returned to the bank and discussed it. The path wasn't straight. It curved slightly, following what they believed was firmer ground beneath the surface. The plan was to guide the next wagon along that exact route, keeping it within the most stable section of the riverbed. It was a better approach, but it still relied on something uncertain. The second wagon moved forward, slower than the first, more controlled. The oxen stepped carefully, guided not just by the driver, but by men walking alongside them, directing each movement. The wheels entered the water, sinking slightly, just like before. But this time, they expected it. They adjusted immediately, keeping the wagon aligned with the marked path. For a moment, it worked. The wagon moved forward steadily. The ground held better than before. The resistance was there, but manageable. From the bank, people began to feel that cautious sense of hope again. Maybe the first wagon had just found a weak spot. Maybe the rest of the river wasn't as dangerous. That thought lasted only a few minutes. Halfway across, the wagon slowed. Not suddenly, gradually. The same pattern. The wheels began to drag more heavily. The oxen leaned harder into their harnesses. The men getting them felt it under their feet, the ground shifting, becoming less stable. They had stayed on the marked path, but the path itself wasn't consistent. That's when they realized the real problem. The riverbed wasn't just soft in one place. It was uneven everywhere. Some sections held, others didn't, and there was no clear way to tell the difference from the surface. The second wagon pushed forward anyway. At that point, turning back wasn't easier than continuing. The weight distribution, the movement, the pressure already applied to the ground, all of it made reversing just as risky, so they continued. A few more feet. Then the left wheel dropped. Not as deep as the first wagon at first, but enough. The wagon tilted slightly. Voices rose again. Instructions came faster now, more urgent but still controlled. Adjust the angle, shift the weight, keep the oxen moving, don't let it stop. Because stopping was what turned a problem into a loss. They almost made it. That's what made it worse. The far bank was close enough to see clearly. Solid ground, safety, just a short distance away. The oxen pushed harder. The wagon lifted slightly from the deeper section. For a moment, it looked like they would get through. Then the ground gave way again. This time deeper. Vasto. The wheels sank sharply, pulling the wagon down on one side. The forward motion stopped completely. The oxen strained, but now they were pulling against something that wasn't just resistance, it was suction. The mud beneath had closed around the wheel, locking it in place. They tried to unload quickly. Same process as before. But the river had already taken control. The more they moved, the more unstable the ground became. The wagon shifted again. Water climbed higher along the side. The decision came faster this time. Abandon it. Save what you can. They didn't argue. They didn't hesitate. Because now they understood. This wasn't a crossing that could be managed with effort alone. It was something else. Something that looked safe, but wasn't. By the time they returned to the bank again, they had lost 2 wagons. Not to force, not to current, but to something they couldn't see. That changed everything. Now it wasn't just a problem to solve. It was a pattern. And patterns on the frontier mean one thing: danger that repeats. The second loss changed the group in a way the first one hadn't. One wagon could be explained away as a mistake, a misjudgment, a single bad patch of ground. But two meant something else. 2 meant the problem wasn't isolated. It meant the river itself was unreliable. And once that realization settled in, everything became heavier. Not just the wagons, not just the supplies, but the decisions. They stood along the bank, looking out at the same stretch of water that had seemed so harmless just hours before. Nothing about it had changed. The surface still moved slowly, quietly, without disturbance. No current strong enough to warn them, no visible depth changes, just a calm, wide river. But now they understood that what they were looking at meant very little. The danger wasn't on the surface. It was hidden beneath it, shifting, unpredictable, waiting for weight to expose it. No one rushed to speak. That kind of silence isn't confusion, it's calculation. Every person there was running through the same question: what now? Moving forward meant risking more wagons, possibly all of them. Going back meant losing time they couldn't afford. Staying meant supplies would run out. Every option carried a cost, but now the margin for error had become almost non-existent. The leader broke the silence first, not with a decision, but with a direction. Check downstream. It was the only variable they hadn't fully explored. If this section of the river was unstable, maybe another part was. A smaller group moved along the bank, heading downstream, scanning the terrain carefully. The rest stayed behind, guarding what remained, keeping the animals steady, watching the river as if it might reveal something now that they understood its nature. Time passed slowly, long enough for the weight of the situation to settle deeper. The two sunken wagons sat in the water as reminders, not dramatic, not chaotic, just there, partially visible, tilted, unmoving, proof that something simple had turned into something dangerous without warning. When the scouting group returned, their expressions told the story before they spoke. No better crossing. They had walked far enough to see multiple sections of the river, some narrower, some wider, some with slightly different banks, but the same issue appeared everywhere: soft ground beneath a thin surface, no reliable path, no consistent structure. That meant one thing. The river wasn't just a bad spot. It was a trap. Now the decision couldn't be delayed. They gathered again, this time closer, voices low but direct. No one argued loudly. This wasn't that kind of moment. This was where experience mattered, where emotion had to be controlled. Options were laid out clearly. Turn back, lose time, burn supplies, risk other unknowns. Wait, hope for change, but with no guarantee. Or cross, accept the risk, but try to control it better. Each option had a consequence, but one had something the others didn't. Control. Turning back meant entering unknown terrain again. Waiting meant relying on something they couldn't influence, but crossing, if done differently, offered at least some level of control. That's what they chose. Not because it was safe, but because it gave them something to work with. This time, the approach changed completely. No full wagons first. No assumption of a stable path. They would reduce weight, break the system into smaller parts. They began unloading. Supplies were divided into smaller loads, essential items separated from non-essential ones. Anything that could be carried by hand or on animals was removed from the wagons. The goal was simple: reduce pressure on the riverbed. A lighter load sinks less. At least that was the theory. The process took time, more than they wanted to spend. But rushing had already cost them. This time they worked methodically. Once the wagons were lighter, they tested again. Not with a full crossing, but with partial movement. A few feet in. Then stop. Check the ground. Move again. Each step was measured. Each reaction observed. The first wagon entered under these new conditions. Lighter, slower, more controlled. The wheels still sank, but less. The resistance was still there, but manageable. For the first time since the losses, there was a sense not of confidence, but of possibility. They continued, step by step. The oxen moved carefully, guided more precisely than before. The men walking alongside adjusted constantly, watching the ground, watching the wheels, watching each other. Halfway across, the ground shifted again. But this time, the effect was smaller. The reduced weight made a difference. The wheel dipped, but didn't drop as deeply. The wagon slowed, but didn't stop completely. They adjusted immediately, shifted direction slightly, redistributed weight, kept movement consistent. Because now they understood the most important rule of that river. Never stop. Stopping meant sinking. Movement, even slow, controlled movement, was the only thing keeping them above the unstable ground. The wagon pushed forward, closer to the far bank, closer to solid ground. Every step felt heavier, not physically, but mentally. Because now they knew exactly what could happen. And they knew how quickly it could happen. The oxen strained. The wheels dragged. But they kept moving. And then, the front wheels touched solid ground. The difference was immediate. Resistance dropped. Movement became easier. The wagon climbed slowly out of the river onto stable land. It had made it. Not easily, not cleanly, but it had crossed. A shift passed through the group. Not relief. Not yet. Because one wagon crossing didn't solve everything. But it proved something critical. The river could be crossed. Not safely, not reliably, but possible. And in the frontier, possible is sometimes enough. They didn't celebrate. They didn't relax. Because they knew what came next. More wagons, more crossings, more chances for things to go wrong. But now they had something they didn't have before. Understanding. Not complete, not perfect, but enough to continue. And sometimes, that's all survival gives you. The success of the first lightened crossing didn't bring relief. It brought pressure, because now they knew it could be done, and that meant they had to keep doing it. One wagon on the far bank didn't solve anything. Most of their supplies were still behind them, and every remaining crossing carried the same risk. The difference now was expectation. Before they were guessing. Now they understood the rule: keep moving, reduce weight, never let the wagon settle. But understanding doesn't remove danger. It only changes how you face it. They reorganized immediately, no wasted time. The first wagon, now safely across, was partially unloaded again to make room for incoming supplies. The animals were given only a short rest, just enough to recover their strength without losing momentum. On the near bank, the second wagon was prepared the same way as the first. Lightened, balanced, adjusted. The process was slower than they wanted, but speed had already proven to be the wrong approach. The second attempt under the new method began with more control. The wagon entered the water carefully, following the same path that had worked before. The oxen stepped forward, muscles tight, responding to smaller, more precise commands. The wheels sank slightly, but not as deeply as before. So far, the method was working. They moved in rhythm now. Step, adjust, step, correct. The men guiding the wagon watched everything: the angle of the wheels, the depth of each step, the way the water shifted around the movement. Nothing was ignored. Halfway across, the ground softened again. The same pattern. But this time, they reacted faster. Before the wheel could settle too deep, they shifted the load slightly, redistributing weight toward the higher side. The oxen were pushed forward, not faster, but more consistently. No hesitation, no pause. The wagon dragged, then moved, dragged again, then moved further. Each movement felt like it could be the last before it stopped completely, but it didn't. Slowly, steadily, it reached the far bank. 2 wagons across. That changed something. Not confidence, but momentum. The system was working, even if it was fragile. They continued. The third wagon was heavier. Even after unloading, it carried more weight than the others. Some items couldn't be broken down further. Tools, equipment, parts that had to stay together. That meant more pressure on the riverbed. They knew it, but they didn't have a choice. They adjusted as much as possible and moved forward. This crossing started differently. From the first step, the resistance felt stronger. The wheels sank deeper, faster. The oxen reacted immediately, pulling harder, but their footing wasn't as stable. The men getting them felt it under their feet, the ground giving more than before. They didn't stop. They couldn't. The wagon moved forward, but slower. Each step required more force. Each correction had less effect. Halfway across, the left side dipped suddenly, deeper than any of the previous crossings. The wagon tilted sharply. Voices rose, not loud but urgent. Keep it moving. Shift right. Don't let it settle. The oxen struggled. One slipped slightly, catching itself just before losing balance completely. That moment nearly ended it. If the animal had fallen, the wagon would have stopped, and stopping meant sinking. They corrected quickly, pulled the line tighter, adjusted the angle, forced forward movement. The wagon resisted, then moved. Just enough, then resisted again. This wasn't controlled anymore. This was pushing against failure. The men in the water were now deeper than before, not because the river was deeper, but because the ground beneath them was giving way. Each step sank further than expected. Movement became harder, slower, more unstable. Then it happened. One of them lost footing. Not a full fall, but enough. His legs sank deeper than the others, caught in the shifting mud beneath. When he tried to pull it free, it didn't come up cleanly. The suction held it in place for a moment too long. And in that moment, everything around him kept moving. The wagon shifted. The oxen pulled. The water moved slightly. He lost balance. This time, he went down. Not completely under, but enough to disappear below the surface for a second. That's all it takes. Cold water. Unstable ground. Weight moving around you. He came back up immediately, but now he wasn't stable. His footing was gone, his balance broken, and the wagon, still moving, was close enough to become a danger. Someone reached him, grabbed his arm, pulled hard. Not clean, not easy. The ground fought them both. For a moment, neither moved. Then the pull worked. His leg came free. But when it did, it left him off balance again. He stumbled toward the side, away from the wagon, water pushing against him, ground shifting beneath him with every step. They got him clear, but it cost them. That brief moment of distraction slowed the movement of the wagon. Not much, but enough. The wheels sank deeper. The tilt increased. Now they were close to losing it. Again, move. The command came sharper this time. Not controlled. Forced. The oxen responded, pushing harder than before. The wagon shifted forward suddenly, breaking part of the suction holding it down. That movement gave them one more chance. They took it. Everything focused on forward motion. No adjustments now. No corrections. Just movement. The wagon dragged forward, uneven, unstable, but moving. Closer. Closer. Then, the front wheels hit solid ground. The shift was immediate. The resistance dropped. The wagon pulled upward, climbing out of the unstable section. The rest followed. Slowly, then completely. It made it. Barely. They didn't stop to react. Didn't celebrate. Because this crossing had shown something the others hadn't. They were at the limit. The method worked, but only just. One mistake, one delay, one moment of lost control, and the river would take another wagon. Or worse, they pulled the wagon fully onto the bank and stepped back. The man who had fallen sat near the edge, breathing harder than before, not injured, but shaken. He knew how close it had been, they all did. And now the situation had changed again. This wasn't just difficult. This was dangerous at a level they could not afford to repeat too many times. But they still had more wagons left. And the river was still waiting. The fourth crossing began with a different kind of silence. Not uncertainty, not confusion, something heavier. They had already seen what the river could do, and now every person there understood the margin they were working within. It wasn't wide. It wasn't forgiving. It was narrow, and it demanded precision every time. One mistake, one delay, one wrong adjustment, and the river would take another wagon or worse. They prepared more carefully than before. This time, they stripped the wagon down further than they thought possible. Items that would normally never be separated were broken apart. Supplies were divided into smaller loads, some carried across by hand, others tied onto animals to reduce pressure on the wheels. The wagon itself was left as light as it could be without becoming unstable. Even then, it was still heavy enough to be a problem. The man who had slipped earlier was back on his feet. He didn't step forward immediately. No one asked him to. He knew the risk now better than anyone. That moment in the water had changed something, not fear, but awareness. The kind that stays with you and sharpens everything you do next. They positioned themselves again. Same path, same method. But this time, there was no sense of testing. This was execution. The wagon moved forward. Into the water. The first few steps felt familiar now. The slight sinking, the resistance building gradually. The oxen adjusted quickly, finding rhythm faster than before. The men getting them moved in closer coordination, each one focused on a specific part of the movement, angle, depth, balance. It worked. At first, the wagon progressed steadily, not smoothly, but predictably. The system they had built, reduce weight, maintain movement, avoid stopping, was holding again. But then the river changed. Not visibly, not suddenly, just enough. Halfway across, the ground beneath shifted differently than before, not softer, but uneven in a way they hadn't encountered yet. One wheel found a slightly firmer patch, the other didn't. That imbalance created a new problem. The wagon didn't sink evenly. It twisted. The front right wheel moved forward. The left lagged. The structure angled slightly, putting pressure on parts that weren't designed to carry it. They corrected immediately. Shift weight. Adjust direction. Push forward. But this wasn't the same as before. The uneven ground meant every correction created another imbalance. Fix one side. The other reacted. The oxen felt it too. Their movement lost synchronization. One pulled harder. The other struggled to keep pace. That difference reduced their combined strength. And that is when the wagon slowed. Not fully stopped, but close. Too close. Keep it moving. The command came fast, sharper than before, because they all knew what came next if it stopped. The oxen pushed. Harder. The wagon moved. Just enough to avoid settling completely. But the ground beneath wasn't releasing easily this time. It held, not like suction, but like friction. A constant resistance that drained energy with every inch. They were running out of margin. One of the men moved closer to the wheel, trying to guide it out of the softer section. That was the moment everything almost went wrong again. The wheel dropped suddenly. Not deep, but fast, enough to throw off the balance completely. The wagon tilted hard. For a second, it looked like it would tip. Everything shifted. Weight moved. Water surged slightly around the structure. The oxen reacted instinctively, pulling unevenly. If that tilt continued, it was over. Hold it. Someone grabbed the side. Another shifted weight manually, pushing against the higher side to counterbalance. It wasn't enough. The ground beneath continued to give. This was it. The point where previous wagons had been lost. They had seconds. No more. The leader made the decision instantly. Cut it loose. No hesitation. No debate. The load still attached, some of it had to go. One of the ropes was cut. Part of the cargo slid off into the water, reducing weight instantly. The effect was immediate. The wagon lifted just slightly, but enough. Move. The oxen surged forward with everything they had left. The lighter load broke the hold. The wheel climbed out of the unstable section. The tilt corrected. The wagon moved. Not smoothly, not safely, but forward. Closer, closer. The bank was within reach. Every step felt like it could fail. But it didn't. The front wheels hit solid ground. Then the rear. And just like that, it was out. They had made it. But it had cost them. Part of the load was gone. Lost to the river. Not everything, but enough to matter. They didn't go back for it. No one suggested it. Because now they understood the final rule of that river. You don't take risks twice. They pulled the wagon fully onto land and stepped back. No relief. No celebration. Just a quiet recognition of what had just happened. They had pushed the system as far as it could go, and barely made it through. There were still wagons left. But now, the situation had changed again. This wasn't just about crossing anymore. This was about deciding how much they were willing to lose to make it across. By the time they prepared for the final crossings, the situation had become something entirely different from what it was at the beginning. This was no longer a problem they were trying to solve. It was a limit they were trying not to exceed. The river had already taken 2 wagons and part of their supplies. It had nearly taken a man. And now, with only a few wagons left, every decision carried the weight of everything they had already lost. They didn't speak about it directly, but the understanding was shared. Not everything was going to make it across. That realization changed how they approached the last stage. Instead of trying to preserve everything, they began choosing what mattered most. Essential supplies were prioritized: food, tools, anything that would determine survival in the days ahead. Non-essential items were left behind without argument. That kind of decision is not easy, but on the frontier, attachment is a liability. Carrying more than you can protect becomes a risk, not an advantage. The next wagon was stripped down more than any before it. What remained was the minimum required to justify the risk of crossing. They didn't test the water again. They didn't scout. They didn't debate. They already knew what the river was. Now it was just a matter of moving through it. The wagon entered. The process was the same, but the tension was different. No one expected it to be easy. No one assumed it would work. Every step was taken with the understanding that it might fail. The wheels sank. The oxen pulled. The men guided. Everything moved as before, but slower, tighter, more focused. Halfway across, the resistance came again. Expected. Prepared for. They adjusted without hesitation. Shift weight. Maintain direction. Keep moving. The system held. Not comfortably, but enough. This time, there were no sudden drops. No sharp tilts. Just constant resistance. The kind that drains strength instead of breaking structure. They pushed through it, step by step, until the front wheels reached solid ground. Then the rest followed. Another wagon across. Fewer supplies, but still moving forward. The next one went the same way. Lighter, simpler, more controlled. At this point, they had learned the pattern well enough to avoid the worst mistakes. Not perfectly, but enough to reduce the risk to something manageable. Still dangerous, still unpredictable, but no longer unknowns. One by one, the remaining wagons crossed. Some harder than others, some requiring adjustments midway. But none lost. Not because the river had changed, but because they had. By the time the final wagon reached the far bank, the group had been reduced, not in number, but in what they carried, in what they expected, in how they approached the land ahead of them. They gathered on the far side, not to celebrate, but to take stock. 2 wagons gone. Part of their supplies lost. Energy drained. Time spent. But they were across. And on the frontier, that was enough. They didn't look back for long. There was nothing there to recover. Only the remains of what had been lost, partially visible in the water, slowly settling into the riverbed, becoming part of something that would take the next group just as easily if they didn't understand it. That's how the frontier works. It doesn't change for you. It doesn't mark its dangers clearly. It doesn't warn you twice. It gives you one chance to understand it. And if you don't, it takes what it can. They moved on from the river without speaking much about it. But the experience stayed with them. Not as fear, as awareness. From that point forward, every crossing was treated differently. Every surface questioned. Every safe path examined more carefully. Because they had learned something that only comes from loss. Danger doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks exactly like safety. And that's what makes it deadly.